This isn't the first time Tomb Raider has been on its last leg, but at this point, unless the series gets another reboot, we very well may be saying goodbye to Lara Croft for good. There's a lot to unpack here, but first, follow me down the rabbit hole because it's time to get historical. Let's take a look at the history of Tomb Raider to better help illustrate just how much the franchise has completely lost its identity and has transformed into something completely new altogether. Starting with Lara Croft herself. When we look back at her original design, it's blatantly apparent that she was created to be quite the power fantasy. People either wanted to be her or be with her, but both desires were impossible because Lara Croft is quite simply on an unattainable level, which was part of the appeal. Not only that, but the exaggerated proportions made it purportedly clear, with the old school graphical limitations at the time, that the character on screen was undeniably female. As we know, there's been a lot of controversy about Lara Croft's sexy figure and fitted outfits. However, such complaints were typically spouted from people who don't play video games anyway and for some reason find an attractive lump of pixels to be threatening. But I digress. Even so, Lara Croft's creator, Toby Gard, who at the time worked with the original Tomb Raider developers at the British studio Core Design, set the record straight that Lara Croft's look was for power fantasy purposes and not some kind of misogynistic thing. Which, I mean, it's not like a fictional woman having curves is sexist in the first place, but I will share his own words on the matter. In an interview with Gamasutra, Toby Gard stated, and I quote, "It was never the intention to create some kind of page 3 girl to star in Tomb Raider. The idea was to create a female character who was a heroine, you know, cool, collected, in control, that sort of thing. The problem with those other games is that the female characters are actually there for purely exploitive purposes. I know you could argue that Lara with her comic book style, over-the-top figure is exploitative, but I don't agree. I think it's ridiculous to say that portraying stylized people is degrading." End quote. In contrast, what we've seen from the American studio, Crystal Dynamics, after inheriting the franchise and rebooting it, is the antithesis of what Lara Croft was created to be. They made it their mission to turn Lara from an unattainable power fantasy to a girl next door. And I mean, yeah, is she cute? Of course. But progressively downsizing her curves and lowering her stature, as well as animating her with perpetually frightened and sad expressions, completely eliminated the intimidation factor that Lara originally possessed. This was a deliberate effort to make the player want to see Lara Croft as vulnerable and needing protection. Executive producer Ron Rosenberg said in an interview with Kotaku, quote, "There, the player, more like I want to protect her. There's this sort of dynamic of I'm going to this adventure with her and trying to protect her. She's definitely the hero, but you're kind of like her helper. When you see her have to face these challenges, you start to root for her in a way that you might not root for a male character. The ability to see her as a human is even more enticing to me than the more sexualized version of yesteryear. She literally goes from zero to hero. We're sort of building her up, and just when she gets confident, we break her down again." End quote. So for some reason, taking Lara Croft's power away somehow makes her less sexist. Make it make sense. Now, I know the argument behind all these changes that the devs constantly have thrown in the faces of classic fans has been, well, this is her origin story. She has yet to become the Tomb Raider. Okay. Let's just look back and see Lara Croft's original origin story dating back to 1999's Tomb Raider: The Last Revelation, where we see a 16-year-old Lara Croft with every bit of spunk and thirst for adventure that we all recognize from the original character that Lara was. Completely gutting a character beyond recognition both in look and personality does not make an origin story. There are better ways to show what shaped Lara Croft into the woman she became without taking away her key characteristics, and I personally am under the impression that Crystal Dynamics never intended to give us a true Lara Croft in the first place. And speaking of origins and backstory, the changes Crystal Dynamics made from what Core Design originally established drastically diminished everything that drove Lara Croft as a person, her motivations, and what made her who she was. In Lara's original backstory, she grew up in a wealthy family, and her parents had arranged a marriage for her with the Earl of Farrington. At 21 years old, Lara found herself the only survivor of a tragic plane crash where she was forced to trek through the Himalayas to survive, which had a resounding impact on her and fueled her thirst for adventure even more. Ultimately, she declined marrying the Earl, and her parents disowned her for it. Lara chose a life of chaos and thrill for the rush of it all, which made her feel truly alive and at the expense of losing even her own family. This backstory undoubtedly demonstrated that Lara Croft does what Lara Croft wants to do, and nobody can change her mind. You see this play out in her character throughout the classic games, where she wasn't a villain in the sense that she wanted to harm people, but she wasn't much of a hero either, because if anyone got in her way of doing whatever she wanted to do, she wouldn't hesitate to eliminate the distraction. Would she help people sometimes? If it fell in line with her own interests, sure. Would she hurt people sometimes? Well, yeah, same. The key differences Crystal Dynamics have shoehorned with Lara Croft's backstory are that her parents died, and she chose to follow her dad's footsteps because apparently he was an archaeologist all of a sudden. You know, the standard Hollywood cliche of the main character trying to be like daddy instead of actually just doing what they want to do because they had their own unique desire for it. Granted, the first Tomb Raider movie started this crap, and Crystal Dynamics just ran with it. It really just hits different when you compare Lara Croft following her dad's footsteps to her previous rebellion-based decisions that resulted in her disownment. But Crystal Dynamics loves to make Lara sad and have the player pity her, so I guess it's on brand with their mission to recharacterize her after all. You see this in the Reboot trilogy stories as well, where Lara is motivated to help others, constantly seeking approval and validation, constantly trying to be some hero, which is not how she was originally designed to be. Now, there's so much more I could cover on Lara Croft as a character herself, but at the risk of making a multiple hour long video, let's just move on to gameplay. This is ultimately what Tomb Raider is all about. As much as we all know and love Lara Croft, she was created as a vehicle to tell the story of the adventures she embarked on. And the majority of said stories were actually experienced through the gameplay itself, and not with a barrage of fancy cutscenes thrown in for the sake of it. By making Lara Croft's entire purpose of living to seek the thrill of adventure, it eliminated any distractions and drama with her personal life, because the adventures were her personal life. They were what she lived for. Once we started seeing the stories try to drum up drama with Lara Croft's personal life, that's when the series started to decline. And I see this as no coincidence. The core pillars of the gameplay, namely the first 4 titles especially, set Tomb Raider apart from anything else from its time. There were a few fundamental elements that quite simply made Tomb Raider, and those were puzzles, dynamic platforming, traps, exploration, and combating fantastical creatures, as well as normal humans and animals sometimes as well. What made all of these elements so great is that they didn't hold your hand, and there was quite a challenge that made the player feel accomplished as they progressed. It was not uncommon for gamers to share with pride when they successfully completed a Tomb Raider title without the use of cheat codes or strategy guides. Puzzles didn't have shiny objects showing you how to solve them. There were no glowing ledges to make it obvious where the correct platforming path was, and there most certainly was no auto grab feature. Some who are less experienced with the franchise often complain about the controls, but the overall control mechanics served as a pivotal role in the platforming in general. By drastically changing the controls, you completely remove a massive part of the gameplay experience, which lies in the tricky traversal that requires you to think about every move you make. With its grid-based level design, you can calculate a jump as to whether or not you need to run first, or grab for a ledge, for example. This is not to say that there isn't a level of polish that could improve the controls, but changing them altogether, and especially trading them in for a mindless auto-grab system, makes for an entirely different game and simplifies it dramatically. For many, classic Tomb Raider even felt like horror games at times. Running into a giant T-Rex or some statue come to life is terrifying. Not knowing what you could run into at any given corner added an intense level of suspense. This, coupled with the fact that there was no bombardment of character dialogue, left for a very immersive and atmospheric experience. There was an incredible sense of actually being at these remote locations that adding a headset, companions, and character dialogue would completely detract from. Looking at the combat, it seems like it was pretty simple because, well, it was. Tomb Raider games were designed to be an adventure first and foremost, above all else. The combat was supplementary, and it did its job of being fun while making Lara Croft feel strong and capable with her acrobatics and marksman skills, but without taking the limelight away from the exploration. Fast forward to the work of Crystal Dynamics, we first saw what aesthetically looked like a Tomb Raider experience in Legend, Anniversary, and Underworld, but with severely watered down gameplay that in many cases felt like it played itself. I like to call this era of the franchise the play school era. While I appreciate the look of it all, ultimately, in contrast to the classics, it feels like the trilogy was dumbed down. But before I get ahead of myself on this, my bigger focus is on the changes that the rebooted Survivor trilogy made, so let's not lose focus here. What we see in the rebooted Survivor timeline of Tomb Raider looks heavily inspired by Uncharted, which is obvious. And while I do enjoy Uncharted games, they aren't Tomb Raider, and having Tomb Raider emulate them felt like they traded their identity from pioneering new and exciting action-adventure game concepts to quite simply becoming an inferior version of Uncharted. The stories are dramatic and focus entirely too much on this new Lara Croft as a person, with added companions to facilitate constant immersion-breaking dialogue and uncharacteristic motivations for Lara. Puzzles have been relegated to mostly physics-based common sense segments that in most cases aren't even mandatory, with Lara annoyingly talking to herself to tell us as the player how to solve them if we take anything more than 5 seconds to just look at everything. Traps are redundant and in slow motion to make it very difficult to fail. Linear set pieces feel like game filler throughout, and most of the difficulty falls on the combat, which is cover-based and lacks any use of acrobatics. And of course, one of the trilogy's biggest sins is, through an effort to keep things grounded, the lack of fantastical enemies. I mean, unless undead-like armies count, which for some reason has been spammed in the franchise since 2008. Have I made it clear that the franchise is unrecognizable now in every way yet? Apart from the intellectual property and main character names, there is absolutely nothing connecting these eras of Tomb Raider, which makes it even more apparent that this isn't a simple origin story, but more so an uprooting entirely. Does this mean the rebooted Survivor trilogy was not good or fun as far as video games go? No. For the most part, they are great games, but there's so much more to continuing an established franchise than simply being good games. Without its identity intact, it tarnishes the legacy it should be respecting. But what's done is done, and it doesn't have to completely crash and burn from here. I think most fans can agree that for what it was, the rebooted Survivor trilogy was a fun detour that we can now move on from and not have to kill off and bury the entire franchise for. Which now leads us to discussing what really matters in continuing any sort of gaming legacy, and that is money. The classic Tomb Raider titles sold millions of copies, and this was with significantly smaller budgets. These titles quite literally made the developers rich with royalties. The grind was real in releasing a game every year, but the payouts were monumental. That said, let's not take credit away from where it's due with the rebooted Survivor trilogy because it did move a ton of units overall. However, sales significantly declined after the original 2013 reboot, so much that Square Enix would not give any real data on the latest release, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which dropped down to a massive 50% off just 1 month after its launch. Given Crystal Dynamics' main focus of overdramatic stories with colossally expensive cutscenes, the budgets were upward of $100 million or more per game, which is a stark contrast of what we saw in the original Tomb Raider's budget of around $1 million, said number reflecting inflation adjustments. Given the sales data we have, it's clear that Tomb Raider's makeover lost its appeal as time moved on. To continue on the same path just isn't financially sustainable, being that gamers have gotten bored with Tomb Raider's modern direction. Obviously, it's unreasonable to expect new Tomb Raider titles on its previous $1 million budgets. However, what we've seen recently has not held traction. action. And as a result, Square Enix has sold Tomb Raider off, bundled with other IPs, to Embracer Group for a measly $300 million. Not that $300 million ain't a lot of coin, but that puts Tomb Raider's value at less than the budget of simply creating one of their recent singular games. That's pretty rough. So what can Tomb Raider do to recover from recent setbacks and not disappear for good? There are multiple angles Embracer Group can go with, but it's very evident that continuing on its recent path will only lead to destruction and lots of sad Tomb Raider fans. Much to our benefit, however, Embracer Group is no stranger to remakes and remasters, and have expressed strong interest in exploring these avenues with their newly acquired titles. Already, this is an increasingly more affordable option than spending hundreds of millions of budget on making Lara Croft cry in some melodramatic cutscene. As it stands, it is very difficult to play the classic Tomb Raider ports without technical issues, especially if you're attempting to stream or capture content. Of course, there are two different directions they could go with this. One being extremely faithful remasters that do not change the original source, but instead simply update the visual quality and perhaps offer an optional modified control system for, the pansies who can't hang with the original controls. Or they could go with an entirely new fleshed out remake that still respects the source, but essentially rebuilds the games from the ground up with accuracy in mind, similar to what we've seen Toys for Bob do with Crash and Spyro. But as great as remakes and remasters are, continuing Tomb Raider further and keeping the legacy going is also pretty important. Crystal Dynamics had previously made it evident that they were going to attempt some sort of unification effort with all three eras of Tomb Raider, which my personal impression of that was that in delivery, that most likely would mean that the Survivor trilogy style would remain most prevalent, but they would throw us a bone by giving Lara Croft dual pistols and a braid and calling it a day. Ultimately, there's no way you can actually unify things that are so drastically different. So at best, I think it would feel like the Survivor trilogy Lara was cosplaying as the original Lara Croft, and that doesn't really sound all that appealing to me. I think it's high time to pack up everything the rebooted Survivor trilogy was and let it die its peaceful death. If Tomb Raider is to sustain long term, it needs to go back to its roots that created such a strong worldwide appeal in the first place. Let Lara Croft be intimidating. Let her be rebellious. Let her be unattainable in every way. Bring her back to the power fantasy she once was. Stop trying to make her relatable and create dramatic stories around her emotional distress, and put the focus back to where it belongs, on creating adventures. The beauty of Lara Croft's origins is that it sets the series up to continue indefinitely. At the end of the day, video games are supposed to be fun, not a reflection of the real world. Taking the attention away from relatability is the best thing Tomb Raider could do for itself again. Escaping the constraints of real life is part of what makes video games so great, and hopping into a power fantasy Tomb Raider adventure that is fun and imaginative is much more appealing than the bleak, melodramatic experiences we have seen in recent years. If we have any hope for Lara Croft to return to entertain many more generations to come, we need to see her go back to her roots. So there you have it for today's video. Feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and to continue the discussion on Tomb Raider, gaming, and much more, check the link tree in my description for my Discord server, as well as everywhere else you can follow me on social media. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time, and in the meantime, go boom.